Hello everyone. This lecture is on Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky, Part 2, apropos of the wet snow. The second part begins with a review of what we learned in the first part. We learned that there are three kinds of modern men, and we see them represented here. The narrator represents the hyper-conscious type. He can never be himself, so to speak. Why? Because, quote, "It used to occur to me, why does no one except me fancy that people look at him with loathing?" Unquote. That is to say, he cannot stop seeing himself being looked at. That is self-consciousness. Then there follows the more normal type. Quote, "There was one in our office who had a disgusting and most pockmarked face, even somehow like a bandit's. With such an indecent face, I think I wouldn't even have dared to glance at anyone. Another hadn't changed his uniform for so long that there was a bad smell in his vicinity. And yet, neither of these gentlemen was embarrassed, either with regard to his clothes or his face, or somehow morally. Neither the one nor the other imagined that he was looked at with loathing. And even if they had imagined it, it would have been all the same to them, so long as their superiors did not deign to pay heed." Unquote. This type is conscious, but not very much, not so painfully as the first type. The level of consciousness varies depending on the circumstances. It follows the principle of loss and gain, so to speak. As for the third type of modern man, quote, "Only asses and their mongrels show pluck, and even then only up to that certain wall," unquote. Asses and mongrels, meaning that they are barely human, more like animals. What does it mean to show pluck? They know how to assert their being in the world. They can take action. As we remember from part 1, in order to act, one needs to be somewhat stupid. That is to say, that's the narrator's formulation, but you have to stop being so conscious. You have to be able to forget yourself in order to be able to take action. So the third type of man is the least human because least conscious, but by the same token, can act in the most authentic manner. On the same page, the narrator once again describes himself, quote, "I was morbidly developed, as a man of our time ought to be developed," unquote. Morbidly developed, that says it all. Developed and as such morbid. But you see, there's the catch. He's making a claim. Morbidly developed is how a man of our time ought to be. It is not pleasant or helpful, and yet that is the only type of development that is logical for our time. Importantly, even the third category of people, the asses and their mongrels, even they show pluck only up to that certain wall, the wall that we talked about in part 1. In other words, even the least conscious people are still conscious enough that they cannot be wholly without a limit. So the overall thesis remains the same. Modern man in general is a coward. He cannot be anything but a coward. That is the way modern man is made. We need to make some comments on the idea of romanticism, which has been appearing here and there throughout the novel so far. What are the characteristics of modernity? We might cite capitalism for the economic system, democracy as the political ideal, and individualism as everyday ethics of interpersonal relations, and so on and so forth. The narrator cites romanticism as the aesthetic ethos of modernity. So he uses these words like romanticism or romantic, or one particular phrase is meant to capture it. Quote, the beautiful and the lofty, unquote. The narrator is an intellectual man brought up on the romantic premise, and his tragedy is the fact that he is confronted by the world that just cannot live up to it. The espousal of romanticism does not mean living by its ideals and principles. He speaks of Russia as a particular case of this failure, but it may not be wrong to extend this argument to modern men in general. Modern men, especially in the intellectuals, enjoy citing romantic ideals as if they own them, but they fall far short of upholding them in their reality. Let's see how he presents this idea. Quote, do permit me the use of this word romantic, a venerable word, respectable, worthy, and familiar to all, unquote. Note how this word is supposed to be familiar to all. Importantly, it is a word whose status is both conventional and real. It is the gap between these registers that eats this narrator, so to speak. Let us continue. Quote, the properties of our romantic are to understand everything, to see everything, and to see often incomparably more clearly than our very most positive minds do. Not to be reconciled with anyone or anything, but at the same time not to spurn anything, to get around everything, to yield to everything, to be politic with everyone, never to lose sight of the useful, practical goal, some nice little government apartment, a little pension, a little decoration or two, to keep an eye on this goal through all enthusiasms and little volumes of lyrical verses, and at the same time also to preserve the beautiful and the lofty inviolate in himself till his dying day, and incidentally to preserve himself quite successfully as well, somehow in cotton wool, like some little piece of jewelry, if only, shall we say, for the benefit of that same beautiful and lofty, unquote. It's pretty clear what he's saying. People know how to talk about the beautiful and the lofty, but never want to lose anything. They cannot not know that the beautiful and the lofty often requires losses. No matter, they feign ignorance. He continues, quote, but among us only the weaklings and towheads lose their minds, while the countless number of romantics go on to achieve considerable rank, remarkable versatility, and what capacity for the very most contradictory feelings. I took comfort in that even then, and of the same mind now. That is why we have to have so many broad natures who, even with the ultimate fall, never lose their ideal, though they are inveterate bandits and thieves. All the same, they respect their original idea to the point of tears and are remarkably honest in their souls, unquote. As a learned man, the underground man took all the teachings of Romanticism to heart, but what he sees in the world is treachery. He is but a weakling or a towhead losing his mind in romantic ideals, while the broad natures go on to attain worldly success even while reciting romantic ideas as if they own them. This gap between ideals and reality is his hell. How does this gap manifest in his daily life? Quote, and among external sensations, the only one possible for me was reading. Reading was, of course, a great help. It stirred, delighted, and tormented me. But at times, it bored me terribly. I still wanted to move about, and so I would suddenly sink into some murky, subterranean, vile debauch. Not a great, but a measly little debauch. There were measly little passions in me, sharp, burning, because of my permanent, morbid irritability. I was given to hysterical outbursts with tears and convulsions. Apart from reading, I had nowhere to turn. That is, there was nothing I could then respect in my surroundings, nothing I would be drawn to. What's more, anguish kept boiling up. A hysterical thirst for contradictions, contrasts would appear, and so I would set out on debauchery." Unquote. One thing we confirm here is that the narrator has devoted himself to the romantic ideals manifest in books and the very activity of reading. Reading unfolds a whole world to him so that it stirs, delights, and torments him. Yet, as he is a person with a body, that is not enough. So he needs to go out in search of other human beings. There's this cycle here going between the romantic ideals as written and given to him in literature and philosophy and reality populated by actual people in blood and flesh. This cycle is related to what he said a couple of pages earlier. Everything came in spells with me. What does this mean? There's an onset of a great emotional commotion, ending in debauchery, which delivers him back to short-lived peace. This cycle of building up tension and then releasing it at its height is a romantic rhythm, so to speak. At the height of this aesthetic tension, modern man experiences profound, dramatic, even spiritual ideas of the world. He may even feel suicidal at that moment. Then there comes a release because no human being can sustain that kind of tension for very long. He's back to calm, often a very conventional kind. Normal men enjoy this rhythm, profit from it. But the underground man is too conscious not to notice how this rhythm finally becomes a habit. That is why his cycle runs along anguish, debauchery, and shame. Shame testifies to his consciousness. And then there is this good summary, quote, "Then the spell of my little debauch would end, and I'd feel terribly nauseated. Repentance would come, I would drive it away, it was too nauseating. Little by little, however, I would get used to that as well. I could get used to anything, that is, not really get used, but somehow voluntarily consent to endure it. But I had a way out that reconciled everything, which was to escape into everything beautiful and lofty, in dreams, of course." Unquote. Note how he does not let himself off the hook, so to speak, too easily, even by the slightest. He does not merely say that he gets used to it, he says he voluntarily consents to endure it. He knows he's not forced to do anything. He knows that man suffers only if he consents. Is this not the most radical form of individualism? The moment we put the blame on the world, we are abandoning the most fundamental element of what we call individualism. And this is a radical lesson. And the second part has largely three events: bumping against the officer, the visit to Simonov, and volunteering to attend the farewell dinner for Zverkov, and finally the encounter with Lisa, the prostitute. Let's begin with the first event, bumping against the officer. The beginning has nothing to do with the officer. Quote, "Once, passing at night by some wretched little tavern, I saw through the lighted window some gentlemen fighting with their cues around the billiard table, and one of them being chucked out the window. At another time I would have been filled with loathing, but one of those moments suddenly came over me, and I envied this chucked out gentleman, envied him so much that I even went into the tavern, into the billiard room. Perhaps I too will have a fight, I thought, and get chucked out the window myself, unquote. It's not difficult to see that this physical fight would put the underground man closer to the third category of modern men, that is the least conscious people, because consciousness is the opposite of the body. The more conscious you become, the more you forget your body. The underground man's reality is the sum of his endless thoughts. The fact that he wants to be chucked out the window means, therefore, that he wants to reclaim his body, the body that anchors him in existence. Another just as important level is the fact that this physical confrontation is a form of recognition. When you get chucked out by someone, you're recognized in your existence. This is why the underground man envies the man who is just chucked out the window. What happens with the officer after after this scene is but an extension of the same logic. So what happens to him? Quote, I was standing beside the billiard table, blocking the way unwittingly, and he wanted to pass. He took me by the shoulders and silently, with no warning or explanation, moved me from where I stood to another place, and then passed by as if without noticing. I could even have forgiven a beating, but I simply could not forgive his moving me and in the end just not noticing me, unquote. The officer, who is obviously much bigger than our narrator, picked him up and moved him as if he were but an object. You see how this is a very different position from that of the man who got chucked out the window. Chucking someone out the window takes effort, and as such, a minimal recognition of the person. In the narrator's case, he is but a body, which is but an object that can simply be put out of someone's way. What is the underground man's reaction? Quote, devil knows what I've given then for a real, more regular quarrel, more decent, more, so to speak, literary. I have been treated like a fly, unquote. What's interesting is that his wish for a real fight, a fight between two equals, is literary. He wants a real fight, but that wish came from elsewhere than himself, from literature. And he's conscious of this lack of originality, his lack of ownership over this wish. One thing we can definitely give him credit for is his consistency. He never contradicts himself on this very fundamental point about consciousness, that he can never elude it. Thus follow several years of pursuit of this officer with the aim of bumping into him. This pursuit is about an extension of this original event of seeing someone being chucked out the window. One thing that he notices while following the officer is what may be called the rules of swerving, rules by which people yield or do not yield to other pedestrians on bustling, fashionable Nevsky Street. People seem to follow these rules without a second thought. That is, people are completely identified with these rules. The narrator stands out precisely because he cannot stop noticing them, wondering about them. He says to himself, quote, why is it invariably you who swerve first, unquote. He's challenging the rules that people simply follow. Let us move on to the second event, the narrator's visit to Simonov and subsequent attendance at the farewell dinner for Zverkov. Simonov is introduced as follows, quote, among them was Simonov, who had not been distinguished for anything in our school, was quiet and equable, but in whim I distinguished a certain independence of character and even honesty. I do not even think he was so very narrow-minded. I had once had some rather bright moments with him, but they did not last long and somehow suddenly clouded over. These recollections were apparently burdensome for him, and it seemed he kept being afraid I would lapse into the former tone. I suspected that he found me quite disgusting, but I kept going to him all the same, having no sure assurance of it." Unquote. Why does Simonov find these recollections burdensome? We can infer that Simonov has changed and doesn't want to be pulled back into the past relationship with the narrator. Whatever they shared back then, he now wants to forget. We might add that the expression burdensome is rather revealing. He now wants to, it implies that their shared memory holds an existential weight for him, some importance which is, however, not neutral because it makes a demand on him, and that is why he wants to forget it. The underground man represents the past that Simonov is not capable of sustaining. What about the other people? Zverkov is described as follows, quote, "He was always a bad student and got worse as he went on. Nevertheless, he graduated successfully because he had his protectors. In his last year at school, he received an inheritance, 200 souls, and since we were almost all of us poor, he even began to swagger before us. He was a vulgarian in the highest degree, but a nice fellow nonetheless, even while swaggering. And despite the external, fantastic, highfalutin forms of honor and glory in our school, everyone apart from a very few minced around Zverkov. The more so, the more he swaggered. They minced not for the sake of some sort of profit, but just so, because he was a man favored with the gifts of nature." Unquote. In short, Zverkov is a nice enough person to the extent that he doesn't have any evil intentions, yet he's also the kind of character who's seriously lacking in consciousness. He swaggers precisely because he does not understand the conditions of his success or privilege. Put simply, he has no shame. He doesn't reflect on the privileges he enjoys, which are all matters of contingency, mere luck. The other two people at the party are basically admirers of Zverkov, worshippers of success. We could dismiss the narrator's descriptions of his friends as motivated by envy and so on and so forth, but we know by this point that he is less interested in attacking others than abusing himself, ridiculing his own inadequacy, his own insufficiency. His worst enemy is himself. The others are criticized secondarily and in the same context as his own failures. He has a single standard, that of consciousness. In a very rare passage, the underground man shares some very genuine impressions from his school days. Quote, even then I was amazed at the pettiness of their thinking, the stupidity of their pastimes, games, conversations, unquote. We'll skip a few lines. Quote, they understood nothing, no real life, and I swear it was this in them that outraged me most of all. On the contrary, they took the most obvious, glaring reality in a fantastically stupid way and were already accustomed to worshipping success alone. Everything that was just, but humiliated and downtrodden, they laughed at disgracefully and hard-heartedly. Unquote. We sense a certain genuineness here because his usual ironic voice is missing. Remember, whenever he hands out judgments on other people, there's always that ironic voice, which signals that these judgments are not to be taken at face value, but only as excuses for judgment of himself. In this passage, however, there is no irony. It is as if he's speaking as the teenager he was, still innocent, dreamy, and timid, yet already intellectual. In short, we are invited to treat these impressions as genuine. As for the unpleasant dinner, I would like to highlight just one element, namely the use of the word intelligence. The underground man volunteers to make a speech. Quote, I straightened up on my chair and feverishly took my glass, preparing for something extraordinary, and still not knowing myself precisely what I was going to say. Silence. Ferfitchkin called out in French, here comes all kinds of intelligence. Zverkov listened very seriously, realizing what was going on. Unquote. Ferfitchkin is mocking the narrator for his intelligence. We know that the underground man was a good student, yet hasn't really risen high in the world, while those who were lesser students are advancing fast in their careers. So Ferfitchkin uses the word intelligence in mockery. Intelligence without success is worthless. It is true that what they are ridiculing is not intelligence per se, but the narrator's painful embodiment of intelligence. But it is a short step. Then these so-called friends launch into an intellectual discussion interspersed with worldly concerns. Quote, everyone sat clustered around him on the sofa. They listened to him with all but reverence. One could see he was loved. But why? Why? I kept thinking to myself. From time to time, they would get into drunken raptures and kiss each other. They talked about the Caucasus, about what true passion is, about gambling, and about profitable posts in the service, about how big was the income of the Hussar Podarzhevsky, whom none of them knew personally, and rejoiced that it was very big, about the remarkable beauty and grace of Princess D, whom none of them had ever seen. Finally, it came to Shakespeare's being immortal, unquote. The narrator smiles contemptuously. Why? Because the whole repertoire of their conversation is indeed somewhat comical. More importantly, there is a divide, an alienation between what they talk about in this high-blown intellectual enthusiasm and how they actually relate to reality. They can speak of high ideals and derive a great pleasure from doing so, but these ideals cannot withstand the far from idealistic demands of reality. The narrator cannot come to terms with this division. At this point, what we might observe is how these friends, disgusted as they are with the narrator, do not chase him off. Why do they let him stay? In that sense, they're but the other side of the narrator. Both parties are vacillating between reason and desire. The underground man knows in his reason that he is not welcome, but he nonetheless wants to stay. Likewise, his friends obviously find the narrator unpleasant and yet let him stay. We might even say they want him to stay. In this strange mirroring of one another, what finally distinguishes one party from the other is the attitude that we may characterize as a general cruelty, even dehumanizing cruelty. Zverkov says, quote, you offended me? I'll have you know, my dear sir, that you could never, under any circumstances, offend me, unquote. He means that the narrator is not good enough to offend him. Once again, the point is not that these awful friends make the narrator look good by contrast. If anything, the narrator is interested in revealing the most shameful kernel of himself by way of these friends. Laughable and debased as he is, the underground man is putting up a fight in this struggle that is not so different from, perhaps, Sisyphus's. In Sisyphus's case, the rock is his imprisonment, and yet, because of the rock, he finds a certain freedom, happiness. In the case of the underground man, the source of the struggle is the modern affliction of consciousness, which no modern man can escape. In that sense, consciousness has the same significance as the rock. So this is a challenge for all of us. Is there an absurd hero in this narrator? An exemplary passage goes as follows, quote, "The thing was that at that same moment I could see more clearly and vividly than anyone else in the entire world the whole most odious absurdity of my suppositions and the whole other side of the coin. But," unquote. This but persists as a marker of a sentence that can never be complete. That's his absurd existence. When everyone leaves the restaurant for the brothel, the narrator borrows money from Simonov in order to join the debauchery, and Simonov throws the money at the narrator. Such cruelty. Once again, it is obvious that he despises the narrator, but somehow cannot act purely out of that scorn. After all, Simonov is also a modern man, and as such, conscious. And we know that a conscious man cannot act in perfect accord with any single attitude. At this point, we might venture a thesis. Could it be that at some level of their consciousness, these friends see themselves in the narrator? Does not the narrator display what an average person would do his best to hide and forget? The narrator is fascinating to the same extent that he is insufferable. He is a mirror of modern man. The whole scene with Lisa is the narrator's knowing enactment of the poem quoted at the beginning of part 2. The poem which represents the romantic ideal of an upstanding man rescuing a fallen woman. Romanticism, like any other cultural ideology, is not without sexual prejudices. So what does the underground man's poetic vision achieve in his encounter with Lisa? Let us look at some passages that might give us clues. Quote, "I turned to her with loathing. I was no longer reasoning coldly. I myself began to feel what I was saying and became excited. I was already longing to expound the cherished ideas that I had brooded over in my corner. Something suddenly flared up in me. An object had appeared before me." Unquote. In his existence that lacks any real sense of being in the world, there appears what he calls this object or some goal. And suddenly his discourse begins to take effect. Lisa now listens with her whole being. By listening with her whole being, she gives recognition to the narrator's being as well. It does not mean that he attains any kind of immediate redemption or repentance. No. Rather, he thinks, quote, No, how can I fail to get the better of such a young soul? It was the game that fascinated me most of all. She turned her head closer to me, and it seemed to me in the darkness, propped it with her hand. Perhaps she was peering at me. How sorry I was that I couldn't make out her eyes. I heard her deep breathing. Why did you come here? I began, now with a sense of power. Unquote. When this rare experience visits him, he does not quite know how to respond, how to return it with his own being. Instead, he relishes the sense of power. But then again, he knows exactly what he's doing. He knows that he's relishing that sense of power, which means he does not fully achieve that sense of power either. In other words, his consciousness gets in the way of being fully guilty of this misplaced sense of power. In any case, he is set on testing his power to rescue this prostitute. And it seems that the odds are in his favor. We will not go into what happens in the final scene when Lisa appears at his apartment and a whole series of exchanges follow there. Leaving that for discussion in class, we will now think about what may be called the truth of the narrator as illuminated in the present scene with Lisa. Something about the narrator flashes in moments of genuine self-exposure, genuine rather than ironic. The first passage that I want to highlight is the very beginning of their conversation, the way he begins the conversation. He says, quote, they were carrying a coffin out today and almost dropped it. I suddenly said aloud, not at all wishing to start a conversation, but just so, almost accidentally. A coffin? Yes, in the Haymarket. They were carrying it out of a basement. Out of a basement? Not a basement, but the basement floor, down under from a bad house. There was such filth all around, eggshells, trash, stink. It was vile, unquote. What matters here is not so much what he says about the coffin and the prostitute carried in it. That turns out to be the beginning point of his long lesson on life, supposedly for Lisa's sake. What I want to highlight is instead the fact that he noticed the coffin almost being dropped. This is the kind of perception that is easily lost on average men. It is altogether too subtle and too poetic to be noticed, a coffin being almost dropped. That tells us something of the underground man. What is that something? I invite you to think about it. Another passage where something like the truth of this narrator is illuminated is found at the end of this scene. After listening to the narrator quietly, Lisa finally ventures, quote, it's as if it's from a book, she said. And again, something like mockery suddenly sounded in her voice. I was painfully twinged by this remark. It was not what I was expecting, unquote. He was almost convinced that he had won her over to his romantic view of life, and now she betrays this confidence. He's displeased. It is at this point that he says something very interesting. Quote, I did not even understand that she was purposely assuming a mask of mockery, that this is the usual last device of bashful and chaste-hearted person whose soul is being rudely and importunately pried into, and who will not surrender till the last minute out of pride, and is afraid of showing any feeling before you. I should have guessed it from the very timidity with which she ventured, halting upon her mockery before she finally brought herself to express it, but I did not guess, and a wicked feeling took hold of me. You just wait, I thought, unquote. The narrator understands this mask once Lisa produces the love letter from the student. He understands also what she wants in presenting this letter to him. Quote, poor little thing, she was keeping this student's letter as a treasure and had run to fetch her only treasure, not wishing me to leave without knowing that she too was loved honestly and sincerely, that she too was spoken respectfully. unquote. He understands that she wants the same thing as he. What it means is that she must now suffer the same as he, and there is no salvation. So he concludes, quote, I said nothing, pressed her hand, and walked out. I wanted so much to leave. I went the whole way on foot, in spite of the wet snow still falling in thick flakes. I was worn out, crushed, perplexed. But the truth was already shining through my perplexity, the nasty truth, unquote. There we have the theme and title of part 2, the wet snow. We will think about the significance of this metaphor as we go on. This concludes our lecture on Notes from Underground. Until next time.